All right. Hi, all. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sara Benitez. I'm the Vice President of Organizing and Campaigns at Faith and Public Life. And I am so excited to be here and joined by faith leaders from states where voting rights are very much under attack, and are going to share with us about the impact of that, potential impacts for upcoming elections, and also, what we need to know about that and what we can all be doing. So, we are in a time in our country where we need what we here at Faith and Public Life are calling a holy recovery, not just a return to what was before the pandemic, but to better, to something more. Recovery also has that meaning. And to us, to make it holy and whole and heal really all of the fractures in our country means that we need to not only address some of the sort of economic issues, but really the inequities that are within our system, through the types of policies that are being proposed around childcare, increasing the minimum wage, home care, citizenship for undocumented immigrants, as well as the investing in our, what's being called hard infrastructure, bridges, roads, removing lead from water pipes. And we also think, though, that for this to be a truly holy recovery that serves us all and puts our country in a better place for the long term and to continue to make those changes that are needed, we also need to reform our voting infrastructure and really make true this democracy that we have yet to really fulfill all the way as it was outlined from the beginning. We have made progress in that, but we are still behind. And we are seeing, not only are we still have work to do, but additional new attacks that make it even more imperative that we make these changes. Because without those changes to our system, without making sure that all people are able to be represented equally and fairly, then the powers that currently get to drive both elections and our economy, the super wealthy corporations, will continue to do so. And as people of faith, we believe that is not, the way that we should be governed, that all people count equally, and we need to make sure that our system upholds that. So that's some of what we're going to talk about today, but we also invite you to just join us in this overall movement and ongoing campaign for a full holy recovery that honors the dignity of all people in our country and puts us in a better place, so we can continue to doing the work of justice in the long run. So now I'm going to introduce Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner and hand it over to her. She's going to offer us some grounding before we start our conversation today.
Thank you, Sara, and thank all of you for joining with me, all of us here today, on one of the most important issues in our democracy, and that's how we protect it. I am Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner, co-convener of the National African American Clergy Network of denomination and independent church leaders representing 15 million members. And we join with you today, all of us, to support the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Law and the For the People Act. And let me just say this, it is critical that this forum take place, or forums like this, because without sounding extreme, America is facing one of the most severe threats to our democracy since the Civil War 160 years ago, and for the same reason, to block the citizenship right of Black Americans, and today the voting rights of all others who are impacted. As people of faith, we believe that every person is created in the image of God, the Imago Dei, and deserve the right to vote in free, fair, and safe elections. John Lewis used to say, the vote is precious, almost sacred, the most powerful nonviolent tool in a democratic society. The vote is not just a civil right or even a human right. For people of faith, the right to vote is a holy right. It is holy because it actualizes the divine imprint in all of us. It is holy because it makes real the saying that our vote is our voice. And it is holy because it actualizes our very humanity. How very shameful it is that almost 60 years after the 1965 Voting Rights Act, we're still fighting to preserve this holy right. And again, that's why it's so important that we're here together today. If there was ever a time that we need to speak out in one voice for the right to vote, that time is right now. Why? Why? That time is right now because our very democracy is at stake. The soul of our nation is at stake. Full citizenship rights are at stake. And the American ideal of justice for all is at stake. 389 Jim Crow-like anti-voting laws in 48 states proposed or already enacted since the 2020 election are directly aimed at blocking the freedom to vote from Black, Latino, Asian, Indigenous Americans, the elderly, students, the disabled, and the poor of every race. Having to fight for the ballot today is like a throwback to Jim Crow laws that we thought were defeated in the 1960s. Nothing could be more unjust than to allow the blood, the sweat, the tears, and the toil of freedom fighters like John Lewis and Fannie Lou Hamer to be shed in vain. And I know we together are not going to do that. The last election was not stolen, but the 2020 midterm and the 2024 general election, oh, they can be stolen without the passage of national voting rights legislation. And if the forces of anti-voting laws succeed in their effort to restrict the rights of eligible voters, they will have destroyed the very foundation of our democracy. One person, one vote. And as any builder knows, if you destroy the foundation, the whole building will fall. The psalmist in Psalms 8 puts it best with the question, if the foundation of law and order are destroyed, what will the righteous do? And immediately the psalmist answers that the Lord is in his holy temple to remind us that God is fully in control because God is on the side of justice and God is on the side of righteousness. Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The call today is for moral arc benders, people of faith, Black, Latino, Asian, white, Jewish, Muslim, to join together to ensure that the rights, that voting rights for every person is protected. No one should ever be denied the right to vote. And that is why we collectively must join together to support the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that fully restores the protections of the bipartisan Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that is why we must mobilize together to support the broader and more comprehensive For the People Act that provides such voting access as online voting, same-day voting, early voting, no excuse absentee voting, stops purging of voters, and makes sure that former felons who have paid their debts to society have the right to vote. And that is why Skinner Leadership Institute and the National African American Clergy Network, in partnership with Sojourners, mounted in 2020 the Turnout Sunday Lawyers and Collars Voter Protection Campaign, where we had nearly 1,000 Black pastors and Jewish rabbis and white clergy join together to protect at polling sites of vulnerable voters their right to vote. And that vote is even more threatened today. So for that reason, we have mounted what we call Faiths United to Save Democracy. This will be a multiracial, interfaith, intergenerational, nonpartisan voter protection and engagement campaign in the 10 states that, and all of them except Alabama, battleground states, Alabama, Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Wisconsin. We will focus on a 4-part strategy of massive voter registration. There are over 2 million unregistered African-American voters, not to mention others in Florida, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Texas. Second, we will mount a robust campaign of securing voter IDs. There are 200,000 people in Georgia lacking voter IDs. We can do that. We can do something about that. Thirdly, we will focus on historic voter turnout. Where did we miss on the turnout? Where will we slack? Where do we need to focus our attention this time in these coming elections? And finally, we will engage in a strong voter protection campaign against all voter disinformation and intimidation of vulnerable. And we will have a 10-state What's at Stake, Know Your Rights webinars that will be across races, generations, and faiths around this 4-point strategy I just shared, and also mobilizing together to make sure that National Voting Rights Act and legislation is passed in these United States. But let us all be clear. The attack on the US Capitol, January 6th, is a throwback to the post-civil rights, post-Reconstruction efforts to use violence to stop, to intimidate, and to put up a block against what America is becoming. America is becoming browner, and no one can really stop that, but efforts are being made through racial gerrymandering and anti-voting rights laws. We are becoming a multiracial democracy, and the efforts of white minority rulership is what we are seeing unfolding before our eyes. Let us be clear what is happening. And that's why you have all the effort to uphold the big lie that the election was stolen. It was not. 80 courts and the Supreme Court said no. The election was one of the most integrous ever. But these efforts will not stop, but nor will people of God, nor will people of faith, nor will people united across race and faith and generation, nor will we stop until we have fully restored our democracy, the soul of our nation, and the sacred right to vote. Thank you, and God bless you.
All right. And thank you, Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner. As we heard, there is a moral imperative to have faith and our faith values brought into how we uphold our democracy and how we make it come to life and really protect the freedom to vote and the freedom of all people to be equally represented. So today, again, we are coming together to hear from faith leaders in Ohio, Florida, Georgia, about the stories of how voter suppression efforts in their states that have been passed or are being debated really mean that we do need federal action to protect voting rights, and that we are calling on Congress to hear these stories and to pass the For the People Act, that it is through federal legislation to fix the voting infrastructure that we can begin to build our democracy in the way that we know it can be. So, some of you may not be as familiar with the For the People Act. What's included in it is the restriction of partisan gerrymandering, the limitation of money in politics and in campaigns, as well as mechanisms to hold accountable politicians for corruption in ways more expansive than we currently have. This bill was brought to the floor of the Senate a few weeks ago, and it was no action was taken, no vote could be had because the Republican Party had already said that they were going to filibuster it. And that's all it takes these days, is the saying that there won't be even debate to stop the progress of any legislation. So that's really also really interconnected here, is around the filibuster and how that structure in the Senate makes it that if you don't have 60 senators willing to vote on something, that's the end of that piece of legislation. Unfortunately, but that is not the end of our campaign or our advocacy. We will continue this struggle until we have that legislation and we have some change at the federal level, and even more reason to hear why that's so imperative today. There was also recently a Supreme Court decision that a lot of analysts are saying could really limit the way that the Voting Rights Act is interpreted and the way it could be used to protect voting rights at the state level and at the federal level. So that is, adding even more urgency to our current sort of reality of where we're at, as well as many of you may have heard President Biden's speech, calling for a moral reckoning around voting rights. And we're really here to push all lawmakers to go further and to take action and to hear why we need to take action. So I want to introduce each, hand it to the panelists and ask you all to introduce yourselves, where you are, your names and pronouns, your organization. And as you introduce yourself, tell us, how does your faith continue to give you energy in this fight for our democracy? Reverend Shavonne, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. My name is Shavonne Williams. I am a minister. I'm also the organizing ambassador in Georgia for Faith and Public Life and Faith and Public Life Action. It's because of my faith, because of my belief, and that at the end, good triumphs, that I believe in these voting rights, that that good overcomes evil. And the hope that I have that's grounded in my faith is the reason that I'm on here today. And it's the reason that I do what I do every day with Faith and Public Life, as well as in my community. This belief that everybody has a dignity and that everybody should be able to have a hope in this union, that we live in. Everybody should have a hope, and that is starts by being able to use your voice at the ballot.
Thank you, Reverend Shavonne. We lost you for just a bit, but we got most of what you said, so we will keep going. Reverend Dr. Joe Parramore, would you like to go next?
Thank you, Sarah. I am Reverend Dr. Joe Parramore, and I'm the Chief Executive Presbyter of New Journey Ministries. And I also serve as the chair of the Florida Leadership Council for Faith and Public Life. And I have been doing lobbying and advocacy work for my entire career from a faith-based perspective, because, I think it's our faith that should create and form our identity, not politics. And then our identity excuse me, then our identity then becomes and shapes our policy in politics, and thus builds the foundation, and thus builds the foundation for the kind of spaces and world that we choose and want to live in. I'm reminded in scripture, but for the least of these. And when my identity is rooted and grounded in my faith, then my policies reflect, but for the least of these. And, I have been told that I suffer from true believerism because I have endless hope, because in my tradition, the Christian tradition, there was the greatest teacher that I consider of all, Jesus, who had endless hope in me. And because of that foundation, I believe that we are on the precipice of something bigger than us. And while the battle is not over, we have a voice in that fight. And I believe that the prophet said that, you know, take your watch, stand on the wall. And that's what this movement is now doing, is we're taking our watch and we're standing on the wall, and we're beginning to speak with a prophetic voice against the atrocities that are coming out of many of those in DC.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Jalada? And do you use, I'm sorry, do you use anything else with your name? I want to make sure
No.
Just checking. Go ahead.
No. But thank you so much, Sara. And I want to thank Faith in Public Life for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. I am not clergy, but as a woman of faith, and as I always like to say, a praying woman, I think that I'm just glad that we're having this conversation. I am here as a state lead with Lawyers and Callers. Turnout Sunday, I've been working with Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner for the last couple of years. I am an advocate. I'm also the regional coordinator for Black Women's Roundtable. And I've actually been a labor leader, a labor activist for the last 30 years. So I got my training in organizing through the labor movement. Pastor Parramore likes that. And still active in the labor movement. I still have a seat on the AFL-CIO executive committee. You know, I'm going to be there till I die, probably. But all of that advocacy and all of that work in politics and working for working people, fighting for working people, was preparation. My faith was, once that became clear to me that my assignment was to do this work. Now, unlike so many others, I actually had a conversion in my life at 50 years old. Okay. I was Muslim for 30 years, converted, was blown away at a church service. And actually I'm still a member of that church today. But when I converted to Christianity, when I came back to, I was raised in it, but it was clear to me that God had saved me for an assignment. And my assignment was to do this work, to fight for justice, to make sure that we speak for those who can't speak for themselves, and to understand that this work wasn't about politics. This work is about his people, and it's about making sure that we do what he wants us to do, and that this kingdom, that his kingdom is reflective of everybody. And we can't do that if we're not fighting for justice.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for sharing, not only how you come to this work, but what fuels you every day. I think that it's important we center ourselves in that way and kind of bring it back to why faith and what does that mean to be talking about, not just talking about faith values, but really being driven by that in this work around the fight for democracy. So Jalada, I wanted to kind of come back to you and ask a question about Ohio, what's happening there, and why is it so important faith leaders engage in this conversation? And what would be important around getting big money out of our politics?
Well, Ohio, and I don't know how much you know about it, but we've been feuding for a while. This is not a new fight for us. And even though this is nonpartisan work, unfortunately, it has become very partisan in our state legislature, like in a lot of places. So I think some folks may be aware of the Supreme Court decision that came down a couple of years ago. A. Philip Randolph sued our former Secretary of State, John Husted, about purging of voters in our state. We unfortunately lost that case. And the Supreme Court basically said they can do that and call it maintenance as long as they notify people in advance that they're going to be removed if they don't do 1, 2, and 3. So that continues to happen every year. We have on an average of at least 100,000 people per year being purged from the Ohio voter rolls. And the sad part is many of those people are purged in error. You know, they don't even meet the criteria that the legislature and that the court decision has said that they're supposed to meet. Now, I will say that the current Secretary of State actually releases that list before the purging so that those of us who do this advocacy work can look at it and compare it. And what we found every year is that there are, I'm talking about thousands, like 20,000, you know, maybe 30,000 names that are on that list incorrectly. So the whole purging system is a problem in itself. But besides that, now what we have is we have our own regressive voter bill that has been proposed in the legislature. It's referred to as House Bill 294 here. And what they want to do is make even more cuts and make it even more difficult for people to vote early or vote by mail. Now, last year, Ohio was bragging about we didn't have the problems other states had. Everything was great. We should be the poster child for elections. But because of this national move to make voting harder, we've gotten this proposal, which in fact would remove it 1 day of in-person early voting. It would roll back the time that people are allowed to request absentee ballots. So right now you can request an absentee ballot up to 3 days before election day. This will roll it back to 10 days before election day. However, they're not making it earlier. So there's a 29-day early voting period in Ohio. So instead of saying, okay, we're going to move it back to 10 days, but you can request it earlier. So we'll go to 39 days or 40 days and pick up that time on the other end. Nope, they just want to cut it. So we're going from 29, the proposals go from 29 to 19 days to remove 1 day of in-person early voting, to make it harder for people to drop their ballots off and put them in a ballot box at the Board of Elections. They only want to do that the last 10 days. They don't want people to be able to drop off their absentee applications. And what I think is one of the worst things is the Secretary of State was always allowed to pay for prepaid postage envelopes. So people who applied for a ballot would not have to worry about paying for postage. Well, the legislature is proposing that that can't be done anymore unless the Secretary of State gets approval from the legislature. Okay, now these are the same guys that are saying they don't want it to happen. The chance of them approving it is probably slim and none. But this is some of the things that they are proposing in this new regressive bill. And even the one piece that everybody was fighting for, which was the ability to apply for that absentee ballot online. Because right now you have to fill out an application, send it in, then get the ballot, and then send the ballot back when you vote by mail. Everyone was like, okay, why can't you just apply online? So they're like, you know what, that makes sense. But if you apply online, you need 2 forms of ID to be submitted electronically to the Secretary of State's office in order to get the ballot. Now, my response was, I didn't need 2 forms of ID to buy my house. So why do I need 2 forms of identification to request a ballot? When I'm sending you a copy of my driver's license, that should be good enough. But these are the kind of things that we're dealing with, because the bottom line is, even though Ohio is, been run by one party, if you look at the amount of votes cast in Ohio, they're really pretty close as far as the 2-party system goes. The problem is gerrymandering. And because of that gerrymandering, they still got a 2-to-1 advantage in the Ohio legislature. So even though we may have almost a 50, let's say a 52 to 48 split as far as the amount of votes per party, because of gerrymandering, they just control the agenda and they continue to ram through these kind of things. And what it does is it makes it harder for, of course, poor people. It makes it harder for minorities. And some of these changes are going to make it much harder for rural voters, some of their voters, to be able to vote. I don't know that they understand. Sometimes people get so caught up in trying to make things difficult that they can kind of, as the old folks say, cut off their nose to spite their face. this may be one of those situations. So we are really, really, trying to fight this bill.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And we'll hear from the other folks about what's happening in their states. And then I'd love to come back and hear about why it's, from everyone again, why it's so important that faith leaders and people of faith be speaking up. Because we do, I think, even though we just, we sort of started talking about it, but it's often that we think, oh, well, we just need to speak up or maybe, but not about our faith or not as people of faith or faith leaders. So want to circle back to that. I also want to note, because I didn't say this at the beginning, but this is very much a nonpartisan issue conversation. But as you said, Jalada, there are some ways this has become politicized, right? Something that should be about upholding the right to vote for everybody. And at the same time, there are in the Senate, I didn't mention around the filibuster, 2 Democrats who are also opposed to changing the filibuster. So just that this is very much is so ingrained, these systems across our political structure, that, this is really about asking folks to go beyond party and really do what's right for country and for voters. So I think just wanted to make sure to put that in, to, add that as well. So Reverend Joe Parramore, if you want to talk to us about some of the impacts of the recent legislation that was passed in Florida, what we can expect about challenges around voting potentially coming out of that, and why it's important that we talk about voting rights in the church and during worship services.
Well, again, we are talking about a subject that should be nonpartisan in nature. And there are those that have politicized a very basic fundamental right of every American, and that is to go to a ballot box and cast a vote. And I want to be clear on that. And I think it is immoral when we have those that seek to suppress the vote of anyone, regardless of who they are and how they identify. SB 90 was introduced in the Florida legislature in February. And I sat in that committee meeting and listened to a state-appointed Secretary of State deliver roughly an hour and 40-minute presentation in the Senate Committee on Elections and Ethics of how perfect Florida's election was in the 2020 cycle, and that it was even suggested it be used as a model for the nation. And after Secretary Lee finished her presentation, the chair of the committee relinquished his seat, gave the gavel to the vice chair, and introduced what is now known as Senate Bill 90. And Senate Bill 90 was designed initially to undo this most perfect election that we had just came out of in 2020. And how did that legislation do that? I think it's important to note that the shell of this voter suppression legislation that we have seen in Ohio, in Texas, in Arizona, in Georgia, and other states came from the same building blocks and was disseminated across to the states, and then through their own legislative process kind of evolved and morphed into what is the individual states' legislative bills. But I think it's important to note that the source of this legislation was the same for all of us. We all started with the same information. But through the legislative process, there were a number of amendments. And at the end of the day, like many of the other states, we now have new timelines for vote by mail. We now have new ID requirements for vote by mail. We have new ID requirements to update your voter registration. We now have limits imposed on who can return a VBM or an absentee ballot on your behalf if you are sick or shut in and can't do that for yourself. We have significant changes to our drop boxes that were a huge success. One of the things which is an atrocity in the Florida legislation, it is what we call an unfunded mandate. And the legislature has passed this law, the governor has signed it, and yet there is no funding from the state to impose these new restrictions across the state. And it's interesting to note that 30 of 67 counties in the state of Florida are considered rural and minority counties. Go figure. The reason it's an unfunded mandate. And the drop boxes now can only be used at early voting sites and must have a single person staffing them, during which time they're open. The only vote by mail drop box that can be used 24/7, if you will, is at the SOE's office. And again, that drop box has to be manned 24/7. The other interesting thing is we've been fighting for a number of years restoration of rights for our felons. And now, as a form of embarrassment, they have redid the public records on returning citizens, and that will now be noted in your voter file and be made known to the public if you are a returning citizen from the criminal justice system, which is just another form of intimidation. So the impacts that we face right now, obviously, will be voter turnout, largely in part in our rural and minority counties that rely so heavily on vote by mail, absentee ballots, and our vulnerable populations, those that are in long-term care facilities, those that are in assisted living facilities, that have always had trusted individuals that they can rely on to help them in this process. And that is a travesty across this state. And so when I think of if we don't do something federally, then it's really a conversation I tremble to have if we don't do something, because what we have already seen in the rise of white Christian nationalism, and they're poising themselves to, run the world, if you will. Let's be real in this conversation. And the only way to combat that ideology is that we have to fight this, and we have to fight it at the federal level, because obviously if the federal government does not step in, then the state and local governments will take over our country for them. And that's what we need to be mindful of. And I go back, and one of the things that frustrates me in this process, and for those of us that work and walk the hallways of state capitals across this country, many of those politicians say, well, my faith is a guiding principle for what I do. I can't tell you how many times that I have heard that. And I'm at a place in my journey where I have began to call them out on that faith. Because as I said earlier, that my identity has to be rooted in my faith, not in my politics. And when my identity is then rooted in my faith, then that identity as a person of faith is then exhibited in my policy making ability. And it goes back to the least of these. And when we forsake those, then there will be a day of being held accountable. And I believe that. And so that's why it is so important that we carry this message from that wall that we've been placed on, that we carry it and we sing it and we preach it from the pulpit, that I'm not moved by what I see or feel, but I am moved by that which is in me. You know, Paul once said that I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it's the power of God unto salvation to them that believe. When we become not ashamed to stand up for those that are less than what we are, and we begin to feed the hungry and give water to the thirsty, and we begin to clothe the naked, and we begin to fight for the injustices in our Black and brown communities and communities of color across this country, and we begin to raise that banner, then our identity that is rooted in our faith becomes the policy that we want to see. I think I've said enough. I could go on.
Yes, I think, you know, you said it all. And that's all that to say too, though, this is an issue we need to all just keep talking about until that change happens, and keep making, talking to our lawmakers. And so I'm going to want to hear from Reverend Shavonne about how things are going on in Georgia, what happened there this year, and sort of what some of the challenges are for next year and for future elections, based on, you know, these changes in the state law in Georgia.
Yes. Thank you for this. I'm just so inspired just by what I've already heard, you know, to know that there are folks out there, regardless of your faith tradition, regardless of your station in life, that's just joining together to fight the good fight. In a nation that's founded on the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and knowing that that pursuit of happiness may look different for everyone, but you have those basic rights. And then in the middle of a pandemic, global pandemic, the 40 days of the legislative session in Georgia was spent addressing how we can keep people from voting, not how we can keep get our people healthy, or how we can make sure more people are getting vaccinated, or how we can get a good economic recovery. But Georgia experienced exponential increase in voter turnout for the 2020 election and for the 2021 runoff election. And then after that, our state legislators aggressively pursued ways to decrease that turnout. During a time when there was found no significant voter fraud, no irregularities in our voting, they wanted to change what our voting looked like. And so out of a myriad of bills that was introduced in our House and in our Senate on the state level for the legislative session, the Omnibus Bill, Senate Bill 202 was ultimately passed. And it created so many different hurdles that our folks will have to jump over just for their basic right. That, as many have already said, is a nonpartisan issue. Because in order for our government to be a representative democracy like it is, you got to hear from the voices of the people in order to represent them. The Senate Bill 202 that was ultimately passed in Georgia has created a lot of new hurdles to voting, including decreasing the days you could request your absentee ballot. It previously was 180 days. It's 77 days now, and the cutoff is much sooner than it was previously. It's changed the voter ID law. In fact, some of our people that are in rural areas, or some of our people that are poor, that don't have access to printers or scanners or other technology, will be affected by these new laws, and be affected by the mail-in process. It changed the fact that you can't even give water or something to eat to somebody that's in the long lines that we know that Georgians experienced. The SB 202 also decreased the number of days between the runoff election. This past runoff election, new eligible voters, say your birthday happened to be November the 15th, you were able to go ahead and register to vote and be able to participate in the voting process by voting in the runoff election. Well, currently now, they decreased the number of days. Suppose your birthday was actually January the 2nd and the runoff election was January the 5th. What the cutoff is now 29 days prior to an election. They changed the runoff period to 28 days, right outside the cutoff period for being able to register to vote in between elections. One of the things I love with the For the People Act, the For the People Act will level the playing ground across the nation. If we're supposed to be one nation, we're supposed to be the United States, then our federal government is going to be key in making sure the basic principles for voting is afforded to all eligible voters in all 50 states. And that is one of the reasons why the people of faith, our faith leaders, have been doing so much. And we've had a multifaceted approach to trying to preserve and protect the right to vote in Georgia and ultimately across the nation. We've been having many conversations with our state legislators and bringing them together with faith leaders. We've had conversations with our federal legislators. Faith and Public Life hosted the offices of Senators Ossoff and Senators Warner to see what we can do to make sure that we protect the voting rights of all our eligible voters. And then we've been also out there educating voters. It is so important as a faith leader that when you have the ear and you are a trusted messenger, that you do the right thing with that voice, the voice that you have. And one of the things we have to care not just about preaching a message and caring about the soul, but we have to care about the physical being. We have to care about the liberty. We have to care about the whole being of the person. And that includes fighting for equity and justice. And the right to vote is, and we've been making sure voters know just how this is going to affect them, so that you know to use your voice to call your legislators, so that they know that it's so imperative that they pass the For the People Act, so that states like Georgia, who've passed SB 202, states like Florida, Arizona, Ohio, and Texas, and all these other states across the nation know that restricting your voters is no longer an option. Know that the voters is who chooses elected officials. Elected officials is not who choose who can vote. And so we're excited that I'm just excited to be able to say it's because of Georgia, it's even a possibility right now. And we can do that. Georgia showed when people show up and vote what happens, because our voice was heard in the federal election and in the runoff. And right now we need to let them know that it's imperative for everyone to have the right to vote. It is not a partisan issue. That is a basic right for our democracy.
Absolutely. Amen. And thank you, Minister Shavonne, for kind of bringing it home. Before we wrap up, since we've had a little bit of technical difficulties, I did want to just check and see if anybody had anything else you wanted to add about why it's important for faith leaders and people of faith to be speaking out about this issue, to be calling on the Senate to pass the For the People Act, or anything that you didn't get a chance to share.
I will say one thing. I'll just say one thing. Throughout the Bible, we see faith and the government meet. And we see throughout the scriptures, regardless of your faith tradition, regardless if it's the Hebrew text or New Testament text, a love for your neighbor, a love for the least of these, looking out for others, is an important tenet regardless of its faith tradition. So as faith leaders, going on that, it's so important that we speak up, that we set the moral ground, and that a sense of justice, a sense of morality, a sense of equity is what fuels our fight to fuel policy. Not the other way around. And what we have to do now is reclaim our faith. We can't let religion be hijacked to as a reason to oppress others. No, it's a reason to love others, and it's a reason to share that love. And with that, that means policies has to be passed to reflect just who we are and who we're supposed to be, and moving towards that more perfect union.
Sara, I'd like to say just a couple of things that I think it's noteworthy. And I think, part of progression is ownership of our past. And we are 40, 50 years behind the 8 ball. The other side has propagated a narrative of faith that suits their politics and does not, in my opinion, fit loving your neighbor as you love yourself. That does not fit how can you love God who you haven't seen and not yet love your neighbor who you have seen. And I could go down the list of that type of narrative of faith that is in direct contradiction to many of our traditions that we hold so dear, and that is so upsetting for me, is my faith is who I am. And that is reflective in my day-to-day life. And I'm reminded of a scripture in Proverbs that says, for lack of guidance, a nation falls. Mm-hmm. But victory is won through many advisors. And I think we have to emphasize that and stress that from the pulpit to the pews to the streets, that the greater our advisors, the greater that our voices become, we can prevent our nation from falling. And that's one reason I have true believerism. But true men and women of faith, individuals that understand this concept of faith, of loving your neighbor, of doing to the least of these, until we begin to proclaim that prophetic voice, we will be in this fight for the rest of our life. And so I encourage all of us, don't give up hope. We know we are in the fight of our life. Mm. And it is incumbent upon us as individuals of faith to not only fight the good fight individually, but fight the good fight collectively. And it is in that collective power, I think, that we can change the faith narrative that has controlled politics for centuries, but we've got to do it through a prophetic voice.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah, go ahead, Jalada.
Yeah, I just wanted to have some closing. I was listening to my brother and sister talk about some of the challenges and some of the things that have been proposed or signed in Florida and Georgia. And some of it is, I'm seeing similarities of some of those provisions in Ohio. So, you know, apparently they had a meeting of the minds and decided here's going to be the framework for how we're going to make voting difficult for people. Well, I think that we need to have the meeting of minds and say, this is what we're going to do to make sure that everyone who wants to vote can vote and is able to participate in this democracy, even if they don't vote the way that I would vote. I mean, this is supposed to be the cornerstone, you know, one man, one woman, one vote. And, you know, I appreciate what, you know, Minister Shavonne was saying about scripture. I mean, God tells us throughout about treating people right and about justice and about your faith in action, you know, and I'm just wanted to bring to mind a couple of scriptures that I like. Isaiah 1:17, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and please the widow's cause. Everybody likes to quote Micah 6:8, but are we really doing what Micah 6:8 says? The Lord requires of us to do justice and love kindness and to walk humbly with him. Are we doing that? And last but not least, you know, Jesus proclaimed his mission in Luke 4:18 and 19, as he read from the scroll of Isaiah, when he talked about the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That's a justice message. I mean, that's what we're supposed to be doing. That's what we have been called to do. So I don't think there's any doubt in my mind, and shouldn't be any doubt in any of our mind, that we're supposed to be doing that work, the work of his kingdom, that we're supposed to be helping, as Reverend Parramore said, the least of these, because, you know, those people who can't fight for themselves, those people who don't know how to speak up for themselves, we should be fighting for them and reminding them that even if they don't really know how to fight, the one thing that we all can do, and I say this to elected officials all the time, I know the politicians care about two things: money and votes. I am not a wealthy woman, but I can vote in every single election. And so we need to remind our brothers and sisters who we worship with, who we work with, who we fight for, that everybody has the right to vote, and that vote, that choice, that selection is in fact their part in seeking justice.
Absolutely. And wow, you all, have inspired and energized me. And I hope everybody else who's listening, not just with, the challenges, but really the call to action that we are all being called to at this time. And that we have to keep on until we achieve that goal of justice and that all people are represented fairly through their vote, because our vote is sacred. So I wanted to share, I put this in the chat, that if you're ready to take action right now, there's never, it's always a good time to call your senators' offices, call the Capitol switchboard. I put the number in the chat. It's 202-224-3121. Ask to be connected to the senator from your state, and then call back again and call the other one and say, you are a person of faith and you want your senators to work together with the other senators and pass the For the People Act this year. It is imperative. that this happened. And feel free to add in some of the beautiful scripture and reflection that we heard today, and some of the preaching really that you all shared when you call those offices. Another thing you can do is tweet at your member of Congress. Believe it or not, they do track how many people, what those messages are. And so if you use the @ symbol and their name and whatever their handle is, and same thing, you say any of the things you heard here today, and that we have to pass the For the People Act, protect our voting rights. It is a moral imperative, is an act of justice that we are called as Christians, as people of faith, whatever our faith tradition, because we all hold that all people are equally valuable and that we all must love our neighbor. And this is our way of doing that in this time in our country. So again, do it today, do it again tomorrow, do it every day until we have this legislation passed. And so this is, just one more action we're taking along the road to that day when we do have federal additional protection of voting rights through the For the People Act. And so we invite you to keep joining us. Go to the Faith and Public Life website, sign up if you haven't already to be getting emails, call to action, more events like this. And again, just keep calling and keep tweeting or on Facebook, whatever social media you use, until our voices all come together and are heard and we have the change that we need. I want to thank you all again so much. So honored to be in this work with you wherever we are, and know that there are many thousands, millions more like all of you and like us who are in this this journey together as we bring our country towards true fulfillment of democracy and justice.